So I'm a geriatrician at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. But I also study aging. I'm an aging researcher at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging up in Novato, just north of San Francisco. The Buck Institute is an independent scientific research organization, kind of like the Salk, but entirely focused on studying aging. So for the next half hour or so, we're going to talk about, you guys were asking some really great questions earlier about how can I be more resilient, and you heard a lot about exercise and about some other strategies to be more resilient. We're going to talk about what's coming down the line. What's the most exciting science that's happening out there? Real science that's turned into clinical trials that are happening right now to target aging, to try to improve resilience as we age. I have some financial disclosures you should know about. Since I'm a basic scientist and I do collaborate with industry to help bring ideas into reality, and one of those companies that we collaborate with helped to create a molecule that we're now using in clinical trials, Component Health. So I'll point out when that becomes relevant later. We are all aging. We're all aging across our entire lives. It doesn't start when you turn 30 or 40 or 50 or 60. We're all aging. And in a way, you can think about our progress through life as this: when we're very young, we have a lot of resilience. Kids can get through anything and bounce back. When I was a kid, I slammed a car door on my finger and emerged unscathed. We gradually lose that resilience, though, as we get older. And this is one of the hallmarks of getting older. If I were to slam my finger on a car door now, I'd probably be in a cast for a few weeks. As we get older, we're also more exposed to gradual problems that come up with aging. And we'll talk about how you can measure these problems from the very clinical. Gradually, you have more and more pill bottles in your pill cabinet. Gradually, your medical record gets longer and longer, but also the molecules and the cells. And one way to think about this transition through life is that we go from being more resilient to being less resilient, and kind of the mirror image of less resilient is frailty. Frailty, a state of vulnerability, of loss of resilience. My favorite example of this, Dr. Whitson gave a great example, by the way, with her dad and her grandkids getting the same virus, but then probably her dad was not going to be playing baseball the next day. One of my favorite examples is when shortly after I started my laboratory, a 22, 23-year-old research associate who was doing some work for me, doing a lot of pipetting at the benchtop and running experiments, and one day he came in with a cast on. He fell off his skateboard and he broke his arm. He was fine, though. It got in the way of pipetting. He had to learn how to use a pipetter with his left hand. He learned pretty quick with that, by the way. But he was in a cast for a few weeks. He got better. He's fine. No problems. No lingering problems. It didn't affect his life in any meaningful way. But everyone in this audience and everyone who's watching, I think, knows that if you're an older adult and you fall, skateboard or otherwise, and you break a bone, and especially say that bone is your leg, your hip, that's not a small thing. That's a life-changing problem for many. And for some, it could be the beginning of the end of their life even. It's a really big deal, even though it's just a broken bone. If my 23-year-old research associate had broken his leg instead of his arm, yeah, it would take him a little bit longer to recover from that, but he'd still be fine. But one broken bone has very, very different consequences if you're young and resilient, or if you're older and have lost some of that resilience. But it's not about your age. Age is not a number. This is one of the most important things that I want you guys to learn from me today. That age is not how long you've been on this planet. It's not the number on your driver's license. Age is about your health, your resilience, your function, and that number is only a shadow, a reflection, a rough estimate of what your aging really is. Aging is biology. I learned this when I started graduate school at University of Washington, and I was studying a genetic disease that caused kids to suddenly age really fast. It was terrible, devastating genetic disease. But it was scientifically remarkable to me that one change in one gene, in one protein, could affect aging in their whole body, so that an 8-year-old kid in some ways was aging like an 80-year-old. But that was a demonstration to me that aging is biology. It can be controlled. We can understand how it works. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this time. But age is not a number. Remember that every time you talk to your doctors, too. Because this is really important. There's very few medical decisions. And sometimes when I'm feeling particularly ornery, I say that there are no medical decisions that should be made based on your age. Now, there are a lot of medical decisions that should be based on your aging. And one of my colleagues at UCSF has done some incredible work about helping to understand when we should begin or stop cancer screening, for example. But that should not be based on your age. If you're an 85-year-old person who's playing pickleball, bad news, you should probably get a colonoscopy. If you're an 85-year-old person who has Alzheimer's disease, who's having trouble walking or not able to walk anymore, who needs care in a nursing home, a colonoscopy is not going to improve your life. The age doesn't matter, but the aging does. I like to give you guys my conclusions in the beginning so you kind of know where we're going with this talk. That aging is biology. The impact of aging on health is driven by molecular and cellular processes that we can study, we can understand, and here's the really incredible thing, we can manipulate. These processes are modifiable. And in fact, we're testing, the scientific field, are testing things that can target these processes, that can modify them in clinical trials right now. This is not science fiction. This is real science. We call that geroscience, targeting the biology of aging to improve human health. And geroscience may be an important path to improving, restoring resilience as we get older. You guys all know that aging is the major risk factor behind most of the chronic diseases that mostly affect most of us for most of our lives. Everything from diabetes to Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, kidney disease. For all of these things, aging is the major risk factor, meaning all else that's equal, you're more likely to get them the more advanced the state of your aging. We all know that. It's common sense. We observe it in everyday life, in our own lives. But it's such a dominant thing that we often don't think about it. If you go talk to your doctor about how can I help to prevent heart attacks, your doctor will talk to you about some really important stuff like controlling your blood pressure, stopping smoking, controlling your cholesterol, screening you for diabetes, and controlling your blood sugar. And these are all really, really important. Treating these things has helped to reduce the impact of heart disease on millions of people, helped to save and prolong millions of lives. We should pay a lot of attention to these cardiovascular risk factors. But what is the biggest risk factor for heart disease? Aging. And if you put them on the same graph, that's what it looks like. You almost can't tell the effect of smoking and blood pressure. And just how important are all those things? Really important. And so how incredibly important would it be if we could just shave a little bit off of the top of that aging bar by understanding the biology of aging that's driving that risk and being able to treat it. Alzheimer's disease, same idea. Whether you're a man or a woman, if you have diabetes, how physically active you are. There were some talks, Dr. Whitson and others talked about the genetics that can put you at risk for Alzheimer's disease. Smoking, these are all really important too, but you put them in the same graph with aging and you almost can't tell that the rest are there. So if we could just shave a little bit off that top, we could make such an impact on millions and millions of people. Cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease are two great examples of how aging drives all of this risk. And so therefore, it's not a coincidence if you or your friends or your family suddenly notice that, my number of pills is proliferating. What are those pill bottles getting up to? And when I close the cabinet door. Why why does my doctor suddenly have so many things on his list? And every time I see my doctor, there's another problem that he tells me about. It's not a coincidence. If aging is driving all these things, then getting one indicates that you're at higher risk for getting another, because it's the aging that's pushing everything. We call this multimorbidity in the geriatric field. It's the idea that things tend to run together, and so most people with one medical problem have other medical problems too. It's really important for studying how to best improve the health of older adults, because this is why geriatricians know it's not really good enough to see a doctor for your heart and see a doctor for your kidney and see a doctor for your lungs and see a doctor for this and that. They all have to talk and come up with a plan together, because all those different problems, all those different diseases, all affect each other too. So treating all of you, treating all of the problems, treating the multimorbidity becomes really important as we get older. That's one example of how aging impacts our health as a risk factor for disease, and so we're more likely to get diseases as we get older. But there are other ways that aging impacts our health too, which can be just as important. So one is that our bodies change as we age, and sometimes in predictable ways that happen to basically all of us. Our kidney function gradually gets a little bit lower as we get older, and that's really important for how our bodies metabolize drugs, and also how we react to heat, for example. That's why heat waves can be so dangerous to older adults. But there's also that aging, since it affects every piece of our body, aging determines how we respond to a new problem, like that broken bone. So the fact that an older person who breaks their hip doesn't do as well afterwards as a young person isn't just because of the bone healing, it's because of how aging affects every other part of us too. I think of that as like a central processor or a prism through which a medical problem is projected, and changes the way that we respond to it, whether or not we have any age-related diseases, for example. And all of these things can have big impacts on staying independent and on staying alive. So aging affects our health in major ways. And I, as a geriatrician, I mostly work in hospitals. And so I'm trying to identify aging-related problems in the hospital and try to make people more resilient to those and help them recover faster from them. But these problems related to aging can all interact with each other. So you may be more likely to have a severe illness related to a respiratory infection, for example, and wind up with a bad pneumonia. And maybe as a consequence of that bad pneumonia, you get delirious, an acute confusional state that's common with older people in the hospital and something that my laboratory studies. Along with getting delirious and confused, you get weak fast. Your muscles waste away the longer you stay in bed. And all of that can lead to disability, unless you're resilient. Unless your body has enough resilience to bounce back from these problems and get you back to where you were before. And here's where the hope starts to come in. When I gave you that example of my research associate and an older adult breaking their bone, I hope I didn't give you the impression that getting older is bad. Getting older is good. Getting older is fun, and we saw an awesome example of that at lunchtime, right? Because resilience is also not a number. It's not about the age on your driver's license. And you can be resilient at any age. Like Dr. Whitson, I'm going to share a family anecdote. When my grandmother was 90, my grandmother was staunchly independent. When she was 94, she was living by herself, taking care of everything she needed to take care of, with a little help here and there. Anyone who looked at her, or any doctor who saw her, would say she was frail. She had a hard time walking around. She had a hard time reaching things. She got tired easily, but she was staunchly independent. And then she had a big stroke. A big stroke, the kind that leaves you not able to move one side of your body. And went to the hospital, was fortunately treated with medicines to break up that clot, but still, it was a big stroke. Any reasonable person would think that was the end of her independence. But it wasn't. As frail as she was, she bounced back from that stroke. She went to acute rehab. She learned to walk again. She got strong again, and she went home. And she went back to being independent. So as frail as she was, she had that resilience at 94. And so do many of you. One of my research goals is to figure out how to give that resilience to everybody. We can measure aging. We can observe and measure aging at every level of zoom. So we've talked a lot today about how to measure aging, how to measure resilience and frailty, looking at the whole person. But you can also measure resilience, measure frailty, looking at the function of specific organ systems, physiology. How fast does your brain work? How strong are your muscles? And you can measure aging at the molecular level by measuring the biological processes that drive aging. And here's where the science gets really cool. We know what most of those biological processes are now. Many scientists around the world have been studying this for 30, 40 years. We call these the hallmarks of aging. They're molecular and cellular processes that are responsible for the changes that we see as getting older. Some of you might have heard some of these things. Who's heard about telomeres? Oh, a lot of people. We were talking earlier about mitochondria. Mitochondria are on that list. Who's heard of stem cells? Stem cell function is on that list. And a whole bunch of others. Cellular senescence, chronic inflammation, even the microbiome in your gut helps to determine how you age. So this is all biology. These are all mechanisms that we can measure, we can study, we can measure them in people, we can measure them and study them in the laboratory, and in the laboratory we can manipulate them and show that by manipulating them we can help organisms, model organisms, live longer and live healthier. To help you think about how to kind of categorize these things in your head, if you ask me, so put all that together, why do we age? How do we age? What's the biology behind that? There's 3 components to it. And this also helps to understand where the interventions and the drugs that are in clinical trials right now are coming from. Okay, so one piece of aging is damage. Just like an old car gets rusty over time, our cells, our molecules get a little rusty over time and can get a little bit stuck. That damage is an inevitable part of living. Living generates, so your mitochondria, in order to generate energy, create free radicals, for example, byproducts of oxygen. And those oxygen byproducts can bind to your DNA, they can bind to your proteins and damage them. You can't stop that from happening. It's just an inherent part of living. And so gradually over time, we accumulate damage. It turns out, though, that that's not the most important regulator of why we age at the pace we do. For example, animals that live a very short time, like the humble laboratory mouse. Mice only live about 2, maybe 3 years. But mice accumulate damage at about the same rate that we do, even though we live for 100 years or 107 years, like we heard about before lunch. So it's not the rate of damage. It's not that mice are generating 50 times the damage that we are. Instead, this second category, stress response, how our cells and our bodies respond to damage, turns out to be really important. This is actually the biggest difference when you look at species of different lifespans, the mouse versus us. The biggest difference is in how they repair, how they respond to damage. We have much, much more robust and comprehensive and busy damage response pathways than a mouse does. And actually, if you put one of our genes into a mouse that repairs damage, you can make that mouse healthier because now it's repairing damage better. So how we react to damage is really important. And this, I'm kind of making this parallel on purpose. I'm talking about molecular damage, fixing DNA mutations, refolding proteins. But we're talking about resilience today. And this is true for the whole person, that is you also. How we respond to a stress is more important than the stress itself. So there's damage, there's how we react to damage, and then there's also when there's enough damage that happens in the wrong place at the wrong time, it can cause a bigger problem, a problem that takes on a life of its own. So one example of this are going back to mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell. You need your mitochondria to generate energy so your cells can do everything else, including repairing damage. So if your mitochondria get too damaged, your cells can't do other stuff too, and that causes other problems, kind of a cascade, a waterfall of problems. Stem cells. If stem cells get damaged enough, they can't replenish your tissues, and that becomes a problem unto itself. So fixing these consequences of aging can be really important. And that's why many of the therapies that are emerging into clinical trials do one of two things. They either enhance our damage responses, they activate our stress response pathways, they make our cells more resilient, help to rejuvenate our cells, or they fix these consequences of aging. Things like improving mitochondrial function or stem cells, or clearing out senescent cells, which we can talk about later. I want to tell you also how important basic science has been in advancing this field of understanding aging. These are worms. Little tiny worms. They're about 1 or 2 millimeters long. If I was holding one in my hand, you couldn't even tell. They're everywhere. Worms are a popular model organism to study all sorts of biology in the laboratory because a worm has many fewer genes than we do. It has many fewer cells than we do. It's transparent. You can see through it. And you can count every single cell a worm has. It's so simple that you can understand it. And so we use that as a model to understand very basic processes that happen in our bodies too. I don't expect that to convince you. I mean, they're worms. How can we possibly learn something interesting about people by studying worms? Well, first of all, what's different about those 3 worms? Size, shape, wrinkles. Yeah, the one on the bottom looks pretty wrinkled and doesn't look like it's moving as smoothly. It's old. That's an old worm. Now, an old worm is only 2 weeks old, but that's old age for a worm. However, that means that you can study the life of millions and millions of worms in a year. So it's a good organism for studying aging too. And to make a long story short, a scientist at UCSF named Cynthia Kenyon decided she wanted to study aging in worms. She wanted to identify genes that would regulate aging in worms, and she found one. She found a gene where she made one change, and think back to when I was talking about the kids with premature aging that I studied in grad school. If she made one change in one gene, she could make the worms live 50% longer. I mean, that's amazing, but they're still worms, right? Let's see if there's a real aging geek in the audience. Does anyone know what that gene was involved in, what that gene controlled? It still is the biggest effect on aging you can get from it that we've observed from a single gene in any organism. What is that gene? It turns out that gene is the worm version of the insulin and insulin-like growth factor pathway. If you study centenarians, humans, not worms, who make it to 100 in good health, the most common gene variants, genetic changes that you see in centenarians are changes in the insulin and insulin-like growth factor signaling pathway. It's the same. And we learned this by studying worms 30 years ago. So basic science and several of the drugs that are now in clinical trials to try to improve human health by targeting aging work through those pathways. So by studying worms, we help to improve our own health too. And mice. The National Institutes of Health supports a multi-center national clinical trial program to test drugs for aging, to try to help X live longer and healthier. Except that multi-center clinical trial program uses mice. That's called the Interventions Testing Program. It's been running for about 15 years now, and it's identified about a dozen drugs that will make a healthy mouse live longer and healthier. Many of those dozen drugs are drugs that are currently being used with people, and some of you may be taking some of them. So by learning that they help with healthy aging and resilience in mice, we help to build a case that we should be testing that in people too. We should be running clinical trials with these drugs to see if they can prolong healthy aging. And so we are. And the mice are helping to tell us which drugs to do that with. So basic science is really important. Please support basic science. This is how we get discoveries out of the laboratory and make it impact your own lives. So this all leads to the geroscience hypothesis, that interventions that target mechanisms of aging, and sometimes we call these gerotherapeutics, therapies that target aging, will prevent, mitigate, or treat many different diseases and conditions of aging at the same time. And so help people Not just live longer, not necessarily, but help them be healthier longer and help them be more resilient. How do we get that into people? How do we prove that hypothesis in people? And how do we do clinical trials of aging? That sounds a little crazy. How do you do a clinical trial is going to test if what? If you live 50 years longer? That doesn't sound very feasible. Well, a lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time now, and scientists and researchers actually have a pretty good idea of how we can run clinical trials to show that drugs or other therapies can make people more resilient, make people healthier for longer, in a way that can even help drugs get approved for these reasons by the FDA. This is actually kind of a solved problem. We know how to do it. No drugs have gone through this yet, but we know how to test them. Just so you know, 3 big ideas for how you would do a clinical trial that targets aging. One is by testing a drug to see if it improves intrinsic capacity. I'm going to talk more about that at the end. Intrinsic capacity is a way of measuring all of you at once, all of the function, all of the resilience you have in one number. Another way is by trying to delay or prevent multimorbidity. So not just trying to prevent one disease, but trying to prevent a bunch of diseases at the same time. And you can run a clinical trial to do that. Or targeting geriatric syndromes, things these are big problems that affect lots of people, but they're not just from one cause. It's not just that you have a heart attack because an artery got blocked. It's because you're falling because of all sorts of problems in all sorts of different systems from head to toe. It's part your brain, part your heart, part your lungs, part your sensation in your fingers. It's all sorts of stuff. Because they're multifactorial and complex, geriatric syndromes represent the problems of aging. And if you can prevent or treat geriatric syndromes, you're probably doing a lot of other good too. So clinical trials can target geriatric syndromes like falls or frailty. And these clinical trials, broadly, you can think of would happen in one of 2 frameworks. One, health span type trials are longer clinical trials, maybe a few years long, where you're trying to slow a problem or prevent a problem and keep people functional, keep people independent. So slowing the onset of chronic disease, for example. The other, especially relevant to today, is resilience. So using resilience as a way of knowing if a therapy is helping someone to be healthier in general. So giving someone a therapy before surgery, before chemotherapy, when they're in the hospital with pneumonia, and seeing if that therapy helps them recover faster. This has the advantage of, well, for one, these are really important moments in people's lives. And as a geriatrician who works in the hospital, I wish I had more tools to help people bounce back faster. But it also lets you run clinical trials faster because you don't have to wait 3 years after a hip fracture to know if that hip fracture has impacted someone's health. And these clinical trials are happening. At last count, something like 100 or so, mostly early stage, mostly relatively small, but still 100 or so clinical trials happening all over the country that are testing interventions that target the biology of aging to improve health, mostly in older adults. And many of these are happening in California, but all over the country with a variety of different drugs and other interventions. And in fact, there's so many that the NIH has funded 2 national networks to help to facilitate these trials happening faster. Your tax dollars at work. One of these national networks is called the Translational Geroscience Network. Very much like a cancer clinical trial network, its goal is to help make it easier for scientists to run these clinical trials that target aging and standardize them so that we can compare results between one and the other. The other, which I'm one of the leaders of, is called the Geroscience Education and Training Network. Why isn't this field moving faster? Why aren't we doing more clinical trials? Mostly because there's not enough scientists who have all of the different background that you need to run this kind of clinical trial. There are a lot of cancer specialists. There's not a lot of geriatricians who are also clinical trialists who also understand the biology enough to run these clinical trials. So our network is trying to bring more people into the field and trying to teach young scientists how to run these types of clinical trials so we can move the whole field faster. Briefly, I'll mention my own interest in my own lab. I study the biology of ketone bodies and how that regulates aging. We were talking about ketogenic diets earlier, so many of you have probably heard of ketone bodies. To make a long story very short, ketone bodies are an important source of energy for your cells that can help to compensate for challenges that your cells have when we get older in processing glucose for energy. But ketone bodies also interact with those hallmarks of aging. They directly they affect how your body processes misfolded proteins, inflammation, stem cells, and other things. And ketone bodies, those biological functions of ketone bodies, many of them are relevant to resilience. They help to control energy for your body, the chronic inflammation that makes it harder to heal or saps your energy, loss of muscle that you experience if you're lying in bed in the hospital for too long. So I did a lot of experiments with ketone bodies in the lab. I did lots of experiments with mice, but I wanted to know how this could help the health of the people that I treat. And so my big goal was to test ketone bodies in frailty, that mirror image of resilience. Because what we think we know about the biology of frailty is that you have a harder time getting energy from glucose, you have chronic inflammation, and you lose your muscle mass faster. And all of these three features are affected biologically by ketone bodies in mice. And of course, I'm happy to make mice less frail, but I'd much rather make you less frail. So we want to test that. So we're running a multi-center clinical trial to test ketone bodies in people who are pre-frail, who are just beginning to slow down, beginning to show the biology of frailty. And this is a collaboration with the University of Connecticut and Ohio State. And we're both testing the biology. We want to know, do ketone bodies work the same way in people as they do in mice? That's an important first step. But at the same time, we're also going to find out whether giving people ketone bodies will make them less frail, will make them stronger and faster and more resilient. This study is currently underway, and hopefully it'll be finished in about 2 years. And then we'll know if the work that the very basic science work that I was doing with mice and with test tubes can actually be applied to improve people's health. That's the sort of clinical trial that we need to do a lot more of. But finally, I want to tell you about the big moonshot, and that is, are there drugs out there now which target the biology of aging and which might actually be gerotherapeutics, might be drugs that could prevent or delay a number of diseases of aging? And how would we know that? How would we run one of these clinical trials? So I gave you some examples of, we can run these clinical trials. We know what outcomes we would use. I showed you some frameworks, how we would do it. Now I'm going to show you some examples that people are either running now or trying to run. One of them is called TAME, Targeting Aging with Metformin. TAME would be metformin is one of these drugs that might, we don't know, that might work through those repair pathways to broadly delay the effects of aging. The group that designed TAME decided to use multimorbidity as a primary outcome. TAME was designed about 10 years ago now. TAME has had trouble getting funding, in part because it's hard to convince some people that one drug could delay cardiovascular disease and dementia and other diseases all at the same time. But TAME is a template, is a model for how we would run a large clinical trial to show that a drug actually does target aging. The goal of TAME was to get an FDA indication for metformin for preventing multimorbidity. And TAME doesn't have to be about metformin. This is an example of how to run a large trial to get a drug approval for a condition that represents aging. I mentioned intrinsic capacity as another potential FDA indication. Intrinsic capacity is a way of measuring function in a bunch of different areas of your health. Cognitive health, physical health, how strong you are, how mobile you are, psychological health, how socially connected you are, your mood, your mission, sensory health, how well can you see, how well can you hear, vitality, your nutritional state, are you well fed, are your muscles strong? Putting all these things together gives you a composite, comprehensive idea of how healthy you are, how well you're aging. You can measure intrinsic capacity in a bunch of different ways. Intrinsic capacity gradually declines as we get older. That's just a different way of saying that we get less resilient as we get older. But intrinsic capacity is a diagnosis. It's a diagnosis that your doctor can make that your intrinsic capacity is declining. And since it's a diagnosis, it could become an indication for a drug too. That if you're starting to slow down, your intrinsic capacity is dropping, maybe that's the time that your doctor should think about prescribing you a drug that would improve your intrinsic capacity. That's the big idea behind the ARPA-H Prosper program. Your tax dollars at work trying to change your lives. ARPA-H is the Advanced Research Project Agency for Healthcare. It funds big moonshot ideas that might really change things for millions of people in healthcare. And there's an ARPA-H project that's currently launching to test whether a drug that's already out there can slow or reverse age-related decline in intrinsic capacity and get an FDA indication for that. The vision of the architects of Prosper is that you'll be tracking your health maybe with your doctor too, but using an app on your phone or some simple things you can do at home, but you're tracking your own health in a quantitative way, and that will tell you when your intrinsic capacity is starting to drop. And if it's starting to drop, now this is before anything bad happens. This is before you fall. It's before you get frail. But if your intrinsic capacity is starting to drop, you go talk to your doctor, and maybe it's time we start this drug, this gerotherapeutic, that will help to improve your intrinsic capacity and prevent problems from happening. That's the big idea behind Prosper. And if it goes well, and you never know in science, but if it goes well, this might be a reality in just a few years. Another thing to tell you about is the X Prize, a global competition that similarly is about stimulating solutions to big problems. One of the first X Prizes was for the first non-government to put a person into space about 20 years ago. The latest X Prize is about extending our health span. It's about reversing that age-related decline in brain function, immune function, and muscle function. And it is crazy ambitious. The goal is to restore 20 years of function in just a one-year clinical trial. But the people designing it are among the best aging scientists in the world. And that doesn't mean that someone's going to actually be able to do this, but it means that these are serious clinical trials that will really measure the effect of drugs and other interventions on aging and will give us a real good sense of what interventions are useful and may also lead to FDA indications. We're a part of an X Prize team at the Buck Institute. We're collaborating with University of Toulouse to broadly to combine the best of geriatric care, all the things you've been hearing about today, about exercise, about reviewing your medications, about fixing hearing and vision problems, and intrinsic capacity-focused geriatric intervention, together with potential gerotherapeutic drugs or compounds. Because probably the way to have the biggest impact is to do the best possible geriatric care plus cutting-edge science together. And finally, I want to end with this all I hope gives you a lot of hope that there will be many tools to restore your resilience in the very near future. This is not science fiction anymore. Studying aging, doing clinical trials, bringing aging research into clinical practice is real. But here are some things you can do today as a geriatrician. If you're facing a big health stress tomorrow, if you're going in for a surgery, if you're getting ready for chemotherapy, here are some big ideas. First, think about prehabilitation. You've all heard of rehabilitation, right? Wouldn't it be better to not need rehabilitation, to do that up front? That's called prehabilitation. Many medical centers these days have prehabilitation clinics before surgery, for example, to get you in the best possible shape for a surgery. A key part of that is exercise, but other parts too, like optimizing your medications, taking off medications you don't need anymore, things like that. Review your medications, absolutely. Update your advance directives. Don't forget that by the time you need your advance directive, it's too late to do it. So do it ahead of time. Do it now. Do it 20 years ago. There's a great tool made by my colleagues at UCSF called Prepare for Your Care, because advance directives, honestly, they sound pretty daunting. It's serious, it's legal stuff. It's hard to know what to do and if you're doing it right. Prepare for Your Care makes that simple. It breaks it down to the two basic components of an advance directive. What do you want, and who do you want to make sure it happens? and walks you through really easy step-by-step and in multiple languages how to put that into legal documents. So prepare for your care. Prepare your go bag. If you might be going to the hospital, have your go bag ready to go. And these are, when I'm working in a hospital, this is sort of my checklist for, did you remember to bring this? Did you remember to bring that? And if not, ask your family to get it. Your glasses and your hearing aids. You need to see and hear what's happening. Make sure you bring them with you. Dentures, because you need to eat and talk. Dentures are important for expressing yourself, too. Your charger for your phone. Bring your list of medications, because as much high tech as there is in medicine these days, the only person who really knows what medicines you're taking is you. So bring that list and tell us. Your advance directive, of course. Bring your toothbrush. Bring a warm sweater. Bring a cardigan to wear so your back's not open with the hospital gowns. And then it's actually really important medically that the hospital be a more home-like, familiar place, and that you not go crazy from boredom. This is important for your brain health. So bring things that will make the hospital room a little more home-like. A familiar blanket, some pictures, things like that. And bring stuff so that you don't go crazy. Bring stuff to do. Bring stuff to read. Bring your laptop. Keeping your brain active and busy is actually really important for keeping your brain healthy, including in the hospital. And then keep an eye out, because it's not going to be too long before we're adding geroscience and we're adding other interventions to this space for how you can stay more resilient for longer. And you are a key part of this. Clinical research involves people partnering with scientists to advance science and figure out what works and what helps. So these clinical trials I mentioned are happening all over the country, including here in San Diego, including up in the Bay Area. Find out what's happening near you and be a part of it. We want not just your help. We want to know what you want, what's important to you. What sort of trials should we be doing? What should we be trying to improve? And we need your help in finding out if these things work. So get involved. It's an exciting time for geroscience, and I hope that you'll all join in. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newman. Okay, our first question. We've heard a lot about biological age today, and I want to know what impacts how we biologically age, and why do some people age biologically faster than others?
Yeah, we all age at different paces, and this is part of why it's not just the number on your driver's license. But why do some of us age at different rates? Well, some of that's genetics, like I mentioned. But a lot of it is the environment in which we live. I don't know if you've heard of the term social drivers of health. Things like access to food, security of housing, wealth and income. The biggest difference, if you look kind of county by county or city by city, the biggest difference in life expectancy is associated with how wealthy those counties or towns are. So social drivers of health are social drivers of aging too. And that's through biology. Social drivers of health work through biology. We talked a little bit earlier today about people experiencing homelessness a couple blocks away. Experiencing homelessness dramatically accelerates your aging. And we actually know this from studies of people experiencing homelessness. They fall, they get frail, they have mobility problems, they have vision problems, they get chronic diseases of aging 20 or 30 years faster than the general population. And they mostly die of chronic diseases of aging. So homelessness is a dramatic accelerator of aging. So that's one of the important determinants in, why is one person age faster or slower than another person? A lot of it is about these social drivers of health.
Great. And here's a question we think a lot about at the Stein Institute. How do we ensure that interventions don't just extend lifespan, but extend health span across diverse populations?
Yeah, every part of that question is important. So one thing is, when we're doing clinical trials, what do we want to show? What do we want to achieve? That's built into how you design a clinical trial. And most of us are not so interested in just living longer. Most of us want to be healthier, more functional. So that's how we should be running clinical trials, to test things that target aging. And mostly it is how we're running clinical trials. The idea of having fewer chronic diseases or having them later, or testing recovery from a surgery so that you recover faster. These are things that are really meaningful and help us to stay functional longer. The good news, though, is that in the laboratory, where we have a lot more experience with treating mice with things that might slow aging, it's actually, you don't really make a mouse or a person live longer without making them healthier in some way. So by making someone healthier, they probably will live longer, but they'll live longer in better health. We already have an example of that, an example to follow and to aspire to. And these are centenarians. So centenarians who make it to 95 or 100 or beyond, independent and in good shape. Centenarians often, everyone will die eventually, but centenarians often have a very small period of poor health, of disability, at the very end of their life. But they're independent right up until that. And that's, I think, what we can aspire to if we can give everyone the same biology as centenarians have.
Great. Okay, last question. Someone's asking about willpower. Can you speak to the power of willpower when it comes to someone's recovery and their resilience? This is a great question.
It's really important. And another way of saying, well, part of willpower, I suppose, is purpose, having meaning. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why do you want to do it? We talked a little bit about that in the panel before lunch. Having that purpose is actually really important to recovering from stresses and to aging in a healthy way, and aging well, aging longer. People who have purpose have better health than people who have lost their purpose. But you can fix that. You can find your purpose, and it's never too late. When we get older, when we retire, as our children grow up, as our grandchildren grow up, you can lose a sense of purpose. What's next? That part of my life is done. Why am I here? But you can rediscover a sense of purpose and rediscover ways that you make an impact on the world. And it's never too late. Our lunchtime entertainment was another great example of that. You can find your purpose, and your doctor may even have tools to help you do that. I know that there's some research studies about there's an app for that, right? About apps that can help you think about what is your purpose. And this can be really important in protecting your health.
That is such a great way to wrap up your talk, the importance of purpose and value-driven activities and resilience. Thank you so much, Dr. Newman, for a fantastic talk. That was so great. Thank you.